The day I went to a motel with my brother-in-law, I never imagined my life would change forever. By a cruel twist of fate, my sister was in the room next door with my husband. But unlike her, I wasn't there to betray anyone or do something shameful. It all started on the day of my sister's one-year dating anniversary. My brother-in-law came to me excited, asking for help to prepare a romantic surprise because he wanted to propose to her. He explained that he wanted everything to feel intimate and unforgettable. His plan was to rent a beautiful room, decorate it with balloons, flowers, gifts, and candles, and spend the evening there with her after the proposal. He asked if I could help him decorate the place, and of course, I agreed immediately. He said he would try to reserve the room for the entire day so we could have enough time to prepare everything before nighttime. I told my husband all about the plan, including the day, time, and location, and he didn't object at all. On the contrary, he encouraged me and thought it was a sweet idea. But on the day everything was supposed to happen, the hotel suddenly called my brother-in-law and informed him they could no longer keep the reservation for the whole day, even if he paid extra. It was completely last minute. We panicked and started searching for another hotel, but because it was a holiday, every decent place was fully booked. There wasn't a single room available anywhere. That was when I suggested, why don't you try a motel instead? A nice and elegant one. At the end of the day, it's basically the same thing. He hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. After searching for a while, he managed to reserve a room in a clean and well-maintained motel. We decided to go there during the afternoon to decorate the room, and later that night, he would return with my sister for the surprise proposal. However, in the middle of all the stress and rushing around, I completely forgot to tell my husband that the location had changed. It was no longer going to be a hotel. It was now a motel. When we arrived, we immediately got to work. My brother-in-law was blowing up balloons on one side of the room while I arranged flowers and decorations on the other. Everything seemed normal until we suddenly heard loud screams coming from the room next door. At first, I froze. They were the screams of a woman, but not just any woman. The voice sounded disturbingly familiar. It sounded exactly like my sister. For a moment, I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. I thought, no, that's impossible. There's no way it could be her. But my brother-in-law heard it too. He stopped what he was doing, stared at me with confusion, and nervously laughed before saying, "Wow, that voice sounded a lot like your sister." Then the woman screamed again. This time, there was no doubt in my mind. It was her. My heart began pounding violently, but not because of myself. My first thought was about him. I looked at my brother-in-law and immediately imagined how devastating this would be if it were true. He was such a kind, loyal, and genuine man. He loved my sister with all his heart and was literally in the middle of preparing a marriage proposal for her. I stayed silent, desperately hoping it was all some horrible misunderstanding, until he slowly looked at me with tear-filled eyes and whispered, "I'm sure it's her." Seeing the pain on his face shattered me inside. Even though every part of me prayed we were wrong, I finally gathered the courage to walk toward the next room and knock on the door. Deep down, I still wanted someone to open it and prove us wrong. I knocked hard, my heart beating so fast it felt painful. My hands were trembling uncontrollably. With every passing second, the anxiety became harder to bear. No one answered. I knocked again, this time even louder. That was when we heard movement inside the room. Hurried footsteps, whispered voices, furniture scraping across the floor. Whoever was inside was clearly panicking and trying to buy time. Standing beside me, my brother-in-law looked completely shattered. His eyes were glossy with tears, his jaw clenched tightly, as though he was struggling not to collapse. I could feel his desperation as strongly as my own. It wasn't only fear anymore. It was the unbearable feeling of realizing that our lives were about to split into two parts forever. The life before that door opened, and the life after. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doorknob slowly turned. The door creaked open as if even the room itself was ashamed to reveal what it had been hiding. And there she was. My sister stood in front of us looking disheveled, her face flushed red, wearing nothing but a loose blouse that clearly didn't belong to her. She blinked against the hallway light, visibly annoyed at first, but the second she recognized us, her expression transformed into pure shock. Still, the shock lasted only a moment. "What are you doing here?" she snapped aggressively, as if we were the ones invading her privacy. Before I could even respond, my eyes drifted past her shoulder toward the inside of the room, and what I saw made my stomach twist violently. Standing there, hurriedly adjusting his pants, was my husband. My husband. The moment our eyes met, he froze completely like a criminal caught in the act. The guilt on his face was impossible to hide. His hands trembled as he desperately tried to cover up something that could no longer be denied. Next to me, my brother-in-law let out a broken, choked sound as though all the air had been ripped from his lungs. He staggered backward, almost unable to remain standing, as if taking a step away from the room could somehow free him from the nightmare unfolding before us. "It's not what it looks like," my sister suddenly screamed, raising her hands defensively. Her voice was desperate, sharp, and panicked. "I swear, I only came here to talk to him. This is all a coincidence. We met here by accident." Her words were so absurd that they felt insulting. A coincidence? I thought bitterly. In motel? Half-dressed. The shamelessness of her lies hit me harder than I expected. But strangely, in that moment, what hurt me the most wasn't even my husband's betrayal. It was looking at my brother-in-law and seeing the devastation in the eyes of a man who had loved her sincerely, trusted her blindly, and was only hours away from asking her to marry him. Seeing my brother-in-law fall apart right in front of me was even more painful than discovering my own betrayal. For a brief moment, I could see him desperately trying to believe the ridiculous excuses, as if his heart was searching for any possible explanation that would make the nightmare less real. But there was no explanation, no misunderstanding, no mistake. He slowly shook his head while tears streamed down his face uncontrollably. He didn't even try to wipe them away. Watching him break like that shattered something inside me. I wanted to hold him, to protect him from the pain crashing over him, but I could barely remain standing myself. Inside me, rage and sorrow collided violently. I felt furious, humiliated, destroyed. Yet compared to the suffering on his face, my own pain suddenly felt smaller. Then my sister realized her excuses were failing. Immediately, she changed her strategy and began acting like the victim. She burst into tears and started blaming my brother-in-law, claiming he was distant, cold, emotionally unavailable. She said she felt lonely, vulnerable, neglected. Every word coming out her mouth sounded more disgusting than the last. Meanwhile, my husband remained completely silent. He stood there with his head lowered, unable to even look at us, behaving like a coward who lacked the courage to face the consequences of his own actions. At that moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to scream, to destroy everything around me, to let all the anger explode out of my chest. But I couldn't move. I felt frozen inside a nightmare that refused to end. Then I watched my brother-in-law turn away and slowly walk down the motel hallway. Every step he took looked painful, as if his body itself was collapsing under the weight of betrayal. Without hesitation, I followed him. At that moment, I knew he needed support far more than I needed to hear more pathetic lies or empty apologies. So I left my sister behind in tears. I left my ashamed husband standing there speechless. And deep inside myself, I made a promise. That would be the last time they would ever see me broken before them. They had betrayed me, yes. But the damage they caused to that good man beside me was something I knew I would never forgive. We walked out of the motel hallway as though escaping the aftermath of an explosion. Everything around me felt unreal, slow, distorted. My heartbeat thundered loudly in my ears while my chest felt crushed beneath unbearable pressure. My brother-in-law looked completely destroyed. His face was empty, lifeless. He stared at nothing and spoke to no one, simply walking forward like a man whose soul had been ripped away. When we finally reached the parking lot, he collapsed emotionally. He leaned heavily against the hood of his car and began crying uncontrollably. It wasn't the kind of cry someone tries to hide out of embarrassment. It was raw agony. His entire body trembled as sobs tore out of him violently, like someone suffocating from grief. I had never seen a man cry with such devastation before in my entire life. And honestly, I wanted to collapse beside him. I wanted to scream until my throat gave out. I wanted to cry until there were no tears left. But seeing his suffering somehow hurt even more than my own betrayal, so I forced myself to stay strong. I slowly walked closer and stood beside him quietly, saying nothing. I simply stayed there like an anchor beside someone drowning in a storm. It took several long minutes before he managed to calm his breathing. Finally, when he lifted his head, his eyes swollen and red, he looked at me with an expression that silently begged for help. "Come with me," I whispered softly. My voice trembled as the words came out, but he understood immediately. I got into my car, and without arguing or asking questions, he followed me. I couldn't go back to pretending everything was normal. I couldn't return home and face my husband, my ex-husband. Even in my mind, I had already started correcting the title automatically. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know what to say, how to react, or where to begin rebuilding my life after what had happened. But one thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't leave him alone in that state. When we arrived at my house, the same house that only that morning had felt warm, safe, and full of dreams for the future, the emptiness hit me like a violent blow. Everything inside carried traces of my husband. The photographs on the shelves, the jackets hanging near the entrance, the coffee mug still sitting in the sink. Suddenly, every object felt contaminated, corrupted, like the entire house had been stained by betrayal. My brother-in-law stepped inside cautiously, almost as though he felt guilty for entering. I quietly locked the door behind us and dropped the keys onto the nearest table I could find. At that point, normal rules no longer existed. There was no guide for surviving a moment like that. There were only two broken people trying desperately to stay afloat after their world had collapsed. We sat down on the sofa without even looking directly at each other. The silence between us felt suffocating. I could feel tears burning behind my eyes, begging to fall, but I fought them back stubbornly. I needed to remain strong, not only for myself, but for him too. Eventually, he was the first one to break the silence. His voice sounded hoarse and exhausted from crying. "What are we going to do now?" he asked quietly. The question lingered heavily in the room, like a sentence neither of us was prepared to hear. I closed my eyes briefly, searching for an answer I didn't have. "I don't know," I admitted softly. "Not yet. We need time to think, to understand everything that happened, to process all of this." He slowly nodded and rubbed his face with both hands. He looked emotionally drained, completely shattered. "I don't want to see her," he murmured weakly. "I don't want to hear her voice. Not right now." "Neither do I," I confessed honestly. For a moment, silence returned again. Then I spoke carefully. "Let's keep this between us for now. Let's not talk to anyone until we can at least breathe again." He nodded quietly in agreement. It wasn't a cowardly decision. It was simply the final attempt by two wounded people trying to preserve what little dignity they still had before facing the outside world. But the pain inside that house became unbearable. Every second there felt like walking barefoot across broken glass. Every memory wounded me differently. And the worst part was that it wasn't only my heart that had been destroyed anymore. The pain I carried inside me was already unbearable, but it wasn't only my suffering anymore. It was his pain too. I looked at my brother-in-law, sitting there on the couch, his hands trembling slightly, his eyes distant and empty, and something inside me shattered all over again. They had destroyed us. They had mocked our trust, trampled on our loyalty, and betrayed us in the cruelest way possible. And even after everything, in that moment, all I wanted was to protect that good man from the ugliness we had witnessed. Because if the world had already abandoned us, at least we still had each other. For several days, the house remained drowned in silence. My brother-in-law practically moved into the guest room. Neither of us had the emotional strength to truly talk about what had happened. Without ever saying it aloud, we silently agreed to survive the pain however we could, each in our own fragile way. But like every tragedy, peace never lasts long. One suffocating afternoon, while I distracted myself by washing dishes I no longer even cared about using, I suddenly heard loud knocking at the front door. Immediately, my stomach twisted painfully. Something deep inside warned me that nothing good waited on the other side of that door. When I opened it, there they were. My sister and my husband. God, even thinking of him with that title still hurt. They stood there hand in hand, as though they were the true victims in all of this. The sheer arrogance and hypocrisy on their faces made me feel sick. "Can we talk?" my sister asked softly, using a fake sweetness I knew all too well. I didn't answer. I simply stepped aside and allowed them inside. My brother-in-law, who had been sitting quietly in the living room, immediately stood up the moment he saw them. His body became tense instantly. Meanwhile, they sat down comfortably as if they had every right to be there. My husband, my ex-husband, looked at me with visible disapproval, almost as if I were the one who had done something unforgivable. Then my sister began speaking. "Look, we know exactly what you tried to do," she said coldly, crossing her arms over her chest. "You created that entire situation to separate us. You manipulated everything." For a second, I nearly laughed from disbelief. The accusation was so absurd it felt unreal. "Are you serious right now?" I asked, my voice cracking with shock. "Of course I'm serious," she replied confidently, lifting her chin as though she were presenting undeniable evidence. "You've always been jealous of me. You've always wanted to ruin my happiness. It's not a coincidence that you took my boyfriend to a motel, and then suddenly caused that entire scene." "Enough." My brother-in-law stood up immediately, his face red with anger. "You were the one cheating," he shouted. "I saw everything. I heard everything. How dare you stand there and lie like this?" She slowly turned toward him with a cold, venomous expression. "Oh, really?" she sneered. "And now you're suddenly innocent? I bet you don't even know what you actually saw. I'm sure she poisoned you against me." Meanwhile, my ex-husband remained silent. He lowered his head and shrank into himself like a coward incapable of either denying the truth or admitting it. Coward until the very end. But the damage was already done. Her lies spread through the family like poison. In less than 24 hours, everyone knew about the situation. Unfortunately, the version they heard was hers. According to my sister, I had deliberately created a trap to separate them because I was jealous, resentful, and obsessed with destroying her happiness. "How could you do something so cruel to your own sister?" people asked me. My mother called me crying, saying she was deeply disappointed in me. My father, always distant and rigid, sent me a cold message saying he wanted no involvement in my drama. My uncles, my cousins, every single person in the family turned against me. Not one of them questioned her story. Not one of them stopped to wonder whether the truth might be different. I was humiliated, judged, and treated like a monster. The irony destroyed me inside because I'd spent my entire life trying to keep that family united. I had always tried to be loyal, honest, responsible, and caring. And now, suddenly, I was the villain. I wanted to scream the truth to the entire world. I wanted anyone to listen. I wanted them to understand that I was the victim, not the traitor. But nobody wanted to hear it, because it was easier for them to blame me than to confront the ugly reality of what my sister and my ex-husband had done. In the end, everyone abandoned me. Everyone except my brother-in-law. He was the only person who stayed beside me. The only one who had witnessed the truth with his own eyes. And honestly, during those days, that was the only thing stopping me from collapsing completely. After days of being treated like the worst person alive, I eventually accepted that there was nothing more I could do. People believe whatever is most convenient for them. And at that moment, it was simply easier for everyone to paint me as the villain. But my brother-in-law refused to surrender so easily. I noticed the way he observed me silently, carrying inside himself a rage that had not yet exploded. In the end, he was the one who suggested organizing a family meeting. I hesitated immediately. The idea of sitting in front of all those people again, people who already looked at me with contempt and judgment, made me feel physically sick. I didn't want to humiliate myself any further. But for him, I agreed. Maybe, deep down, it felt like our final chance to defend ourselves and expose the truth. That afternoon, everyone gathered at our parents' house. My mother, My father, my uncles, my cousins, all of them were there waiting for us. My cousins, a few close family friends, and of course my sister and my ex-husband were all there together, sitting side by side, as if they were innocent victims trapped inside some ridiculous conspiracy. I sat quietly in the corner of the room without saying a single word. No one truly acknowledged my presence. I felt less like family and more like an uncomfortable burden they were forced to tolerate. By then, my eyes were dry. I had cried so much over the past days that I no longer had tears left to give anyone. That was when my brother-in-law finally stood up. He didn't hesitate. He didn't stumble over his words. And he didn't try to soften the truth. "I brought proof," he said firmly. Instantly, the entire room fell into tense silence. He placed his phone on the table, connected it to the television, and began revealing everything. Every message, every photograph, every motel reservation, every conversation exchanged between my sister and my ex-husband. The screen filled with evidence of secret meetings, hidden encounters, disgusting declarations of desire and love they exchanged while pretending to care about us behind closed doors. And while they whispered promises to each other, they were destroying both of us. With every new image that appeared on the television, I watched the expressions around the room slowly transform. First came disbelief, then shock, and finally shame. My mother covered her mouth with trembling hands, unable to hide the horror in her eyes. My father, who had always acted so cold and strong, turned red with anger before lowering his head silently. But my brother-in-law didn't stop. He continued reading the messages aloud word for word, mercilessly exposing every filthy lie they had tried to bury. My sister panicked immediately. She tried to interrupt him. She screamed, cried, and caused a scene, insisting everything had been manipulated, edited, or staged against her. But there was simply too much evidence. Too many messages. Too many dates. Too many photographs. The truth was overwhelming. Not even she could keep the lie alive anymore. Meanwhile, my ex-husband said absolutely nothing. He remained shrunken into the sofa, silent and pathetic, exactly like the coward he had always been. When everything finally ended, silence filled the room completely. This time, however, the eyes staring at me were no longer filled with judgment. They were filled with guilt, regret, shame. That should have been my moment to explode. My moment to scream at all of them, to throw their cruelty back in their faces and remind them how quickly they condemned me without even listening to my side. But strangely, I no longer had the energy. I was too exhausted. Slowly, I stood up, grabbed my purse, and looked at each person in the room one by one. "Now you know the truth," I said quietly. "And honestly, it doesn't change anything anymore." I noticed tears running down several faces. I saw people trying desperately to approach me, apologize, explain themselves, or somehow repair what had already been destroyed. But it was too late. I was tired of begging for love, tired of seeking understanding, tired of fighting for respect from people who abandoned me the second it became convenient. Without another word, I turned around and walked toward the door. I left my family behind. I left the traitors behind. And little by little, I left the pain behind too. For the first time in a very long while, I felt something unfamiliar growing inside me. Freedom. They had lost me completely. And somehow, after losing everything, I had finally found myself. The months that followed were not easy. In fact, they were some of the hardest months of my life. At first, everything inside me felt empty. Every morning, I woke up wondering who I even was anymore. They had taken so much from me. My marriage, my family, my reputation. Everything I once believed was stable had collapsed overnight. But slowly, the pain began transforming into something else. Something stronger. Something that pushed me to get out of bed every morning, even during the days when disappearing from the world still felt tempting. Through all of it, my brother-in-law remained by my side. No longer simply my brother-in-law. He had become my closest friend. And more than anything, he became living proof that survival was possible after betrayal like ours. We started seeing each other almost every day. At first, things between us felt awkward and quiet, like two survivors of the same war trying to learn how to live again after devastation. But over time, something beautiful formed between us. A friendship I never expected. Our connection was built on deep respect, shared pain, and the silent understanding that exists between two people who know exactly what the other carries inside without needing words. There was no romance between us. No secret kisses. No dramatic promises. What we had was far more meaningful than that. It was honest. It was genuine. It was real. We started taking small trips together. Nothing extravagant or luxurious. Sometimes it was just a weekend away, a quiet drive to another town, or a simple afternoon spent somewhere peaceful. But each outing felt important because, little by little, we were learning how to live again. We picked up new hobbies. We remodeled parts of the house that once carried painful memories. We laughed together. Sometimes we cried too. And every small step forward, every genuine smile, every deep breath that no longer hurt so much felt like a personal victory. Meanwhile, my sister and my ex-husband were falling apart. The same people who once believed they had won everything slowly became isolated from everyone around them. Family members distanced themselves. Friends stopped answering their calls. Everywhere they went, they carried the shame of what they had done. It didn't take long before they started trying to come back into our lives. At first, it was messages, then phone calls, then long dramatic letters filled with apologies, excuses, and desperate attempts to rewrite history as though they themselves were victims of their own choices. My friend and I, because that was truly what he had become to me, received those attempts with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. But the final chapter came one Sunday afternoon. They showed up at my door in person. The sight of them almost startled me. They looked thinner, exhausted, defeated. The arrogance they once carried so proudly had disappeared completely, replaced by desperate expressions and pleading eyes. "We know we made a mistake," my sister said softly, her voice trembling. "But we're family." I stared at both of them for several long seconds and realized I felt absolutely nothing except cold indifference. "Family," I repeated slowly before letting out a dry, humorless laugh. "You lost the right to call yourselves family the moment you betrayed the people who trusted you the most." I crossed my arms and continued coldly. "Now you can both crawl back into whatever hole you came from." Beside me, my friend folded his arms firmly and added without hesitation, "You are not welcome here. Not now. Not ever again." And then, without yelling, without crying, without shaking, I simply closed the door in their faces. The sound of the lock clicking into place felt strangely symbolic, as though I had finally sealed away the most painful chapter of my life forever. I turned toward him. He looked at me, and together we smiled. Not because we had escaped pain, not because we had forgotten everything, but because we understood something valuable now. We had lost a lot, yet somehow we had gained something priceless in return. Freedom. Freedom to walk away from people who never deserved our love. Freedom to rebuild our lives without lowering ourselves before those who betrayed us. Freedom to finally be happy without fear, shame, or guilt. Today, I understand something I never could before. Sometimes the worst betrayals are not meant to destroy us. Sometimes they exist to set us free. Time continued to pass. And when I say time passed, I don't mean only the calendar moving forward. I mean the wounds inside us slowly began to heal too. Of course, there were still difficult days. Certain memories still hurt unexpectedly, like emotional scars aching during storms. But overall, life gradually regained its color. And my friend, the man who had become the best friend I could ever ask for, began transforming before my eyes. Watching it happen was beautiful. The broken, devastated man I had once seen crying in a motel parking lot slowly became someone stronger, calmer, and lighter. And eventually, he met someone new. I still remember the day he came to my house looking unbelievably nervous, fidgeting with his car keys like a teenager about to confess his first crush. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said, trying very hard to sound calm and casual. He failed miserably. I immediately crossed my arms and laughed. "Oh, I see what this is," I teased playfully. "You're in love." His face instantly turned bright red, which only made me laugh harder. "It's not like that," he protested awkwardly. "I mean, okay, maybe it is serious. I want you to meet her. I want to know what you think." And suddenly, I felt deeply touched. He trusted me enough to care about my opinion. That kind of trust felt rare and precious. We arranged a dinner together at a simple restaurant, nothing fancy or overly elegant, exactly the kind of place we both preferred. The moment she arrived, I immediately understood why he liked her so much. She was kind, warm, genuine, the type of person who brought comfort simply through her presence without needing attention or dramatic words. The three of us spent hours talking and laughing together. And honestly, for the first time in a long while, I genuinely enjoyed myself without carrying heaviness inside my chest. At the end of the evening, I finally gave him my official opinion with the most serious expression I could manage. "Well," I announced dramatically, "I approve of her, but only because she didn't run away after hearing your ridiculous laugh." He burst into laughter so loudly that several people in the restaurant turned to stare at our table. And naturally, I laughed right alongside him. Seeing him happy brought me peace. That was all I truly wanted. As for me, my path became different. After everything I survived, I realized something important. I didn't need a relationship to feel complete anymore. For the first time in my life, I became my own priority. I focused on my career. I threw myself into work, projects, courses, and new ambitions I once believed I had to sacrifice in order to fit the role of the perfect wife. But not anymore. Now, I belong to myself. I rediscovered my independence, my strength, my dreams. And honestly, I became the best company I could possibly have. Sometimes on quiet Friday nights, my friend and I still met up to talk. We remembered our lowest moments. We laughed about how broken we once were. And most importantly, we celebrated how far we had come. Celebrate how we managed to get up again. He with a new love, and me with a new life. And every time we said goodbye, I went back home with a deep and absolute certainty that some losses, no matter how painful they are, end up guiding us exactly where we were meant to be. Because sometimes, in order to discover real happiness, we first have to lose everything that once made us feel small. Life has its own strange way of proving that everything happens at the right moment. I was okay, truly okay. Not the fake kind of happiness people show to the world, but a calm, quiet peace that stayed with me even during the busiest days. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, and I was organizing documents in my office when he showed up with that familiar, silly smile I had already gotten used to. He walked in without knocking, like he always did, and collapsed onto the sofa, both nervous and glowing at the same time. "I have something to tell you," he said. "If this is about you learning how to cook, I already don't believe you," I replied, laughing. He rolled his eyes but couldn't hide his smile. "I'm going to be a father." For a moment, everything around me felt like it stopped. My eyes immediately filled with tears, but this time they were real tears of happiness. The man I once thought had lost everything was now starting a completely new chapter of life. I stood up and hugged him tightly, so tightly that he laughed and complained at the same time. "Congratulations, my friend," I whispered. "And there's more," he said, gently pulling back, his eyes shining with emotion. I want you to be the godmother." My heart skipped. I didn't hesitate even for a second. "Of course I accept," I said, laughing through tears, already imagining the day of the baptism. Everything in that moment felt aligned. Everything had finally found its place. Everything except her. When my sister found out, it naturally turned into a scandal. She sent angry, chaotic messages, acting as if the world owed her something. "It's ridiculous that I wasn't invited," she shouted in a voice note, so dramatic and unhinged that it sounded like a child throwing a tantrum. I couldn't even take it seriously. I just laughed. I replied calmly, coldly, and with absolute clarity. "The place for snakes is in the bushes, and you are exactly where you belong." After that, I didn't engage anymore. I blocked. I deleted. I moved forward. While I was building a life filled with honesty, respect, and real love, she was sinking deeper into a cycle of failed relationships, repeating the same patterns of betrayal, lies, and self-destruction that she had always chosen for herself. It was sad in a way, but it wasn't my responsibility anymore. I had already learned that you cannot save someone who refuses to be saved. My friend, now preparing to become a father, was thriving in a way I had never seen before. His new partner's family welcomed him with warmth, respect, and genuine affection. Everything he had always deserved but never received in our old world. And me? I stayed happy. I no longer needed labels, commitments, or promises of forever. My happiness came from within me, and that made it real. In this new life, we built side by side. Him with his family, me with my goals and achievements.